Welcome to this new lesson of the course Self-Publishing with GenBookAI, Write and Publish Your Book with AI. We have already covered how to structure a story, create compelling characters, and develop a good narrative pace. But now we address one of the most critical aspects of storytelling: the climax and narrative tension. The climax is the moment of maximum tension in the story, the point where everything changes for the protagonist. It is the emotional heart of the narrative and must be carefully constructed to maximize its impact. A study by Stanford University has shown that readers remember climax moments in stories more intensely, and that these influence their perception of the entire book. In this lesson, you will learn what is the climax and why it is the most important moment in the story, how to build narrative tension to prepare a strong climax, the techniques for writing an engaging and meaningful climax, common mistakes to avoid when building a climax. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to write an exciting and memorable climax that will make your story unforgettable for the reader. What is a climax and why is it so important? The climax is the culminating moment of the story, in which the main conflict reaches its peak and is resolved or transformed. It is the point of maximum tension and emotional involvement. It must represent a definitive change in the story or in the protagonist. It keeps the reader glued to the pages, making the reading experience more intense. Examples of memorable climaxes: The Lord of the Rings. Frodo at Mount Doom, torn between the duty to destroy the ring and the desire to possess it. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. The final duel between Harry and Voldemort, full of tension and meaning. Pride and Prejudice. The moment Elizabeth Bennet realizes she misunderstood Darcy and completely changes her view of him. A strong climax makes the entire story more effective and satisfying for the reader. How to build narrative tension for a powerful climax. An effective climax does not come from nothing. It must be built through increasing tension. 1. Create a conflict progression. A climax is more intense if it is preceded by a series of increasing obstacles. Example: a detective follows a lead, but each clue leads to new complications until the final revelation. 2. Use time and deadlines. The pressure of time makes the climax more tense and engaging. Example: a bomb is about to explode. The protagonist has seconds to defuse it. 3. Increase the personal risk of the protagonist. The climax is most effective when the protagonist has something to lose. Example: the protagonist can win the battle, but only by sacrificing a loved one. The higher the stakes, the more intense and memorable the climax will be. Techniques for writing an engaging climax. 1. Make the climax inevitable but surprising. The reader must feel that everything is leading up to that moment, but without predicting exactly how it will end. 2. Use sensory descriptions and fast pacing. The climax must be vivid and engaging, with shorter and more intense sentences to increase the tension. Example: sweat was pouring down his forehead, his breathing was labored. One more step and it would all be over. 3. Show the emotional impact on the protagonist. The climax must change the character in a profound way. Example: a hero who has always avoided conflict finally faces his enemy, transforming himself into something new. 4. Follow the climax with a moment of reflection or consequences. The reader needs a moment to absorb what just happened. Following these techniques helps create a powerful and emotional climax. Common climax mistakes to avoid. 1. A rushed or poorly constructed climax. If the climax comes too quickly, without adequate tension building, the reader will not feel like it is a significant moment. 2. No real surprise or major conflict. A climax that is resolved too easily or is predictable loses its emotional impact. 3. The protagonist does not change after the climax. The climax must mark a definitive change in the protagonist or the story. 4. A confusing or overly complex climax. If the scene is difficult to follow or full of explanations, the reader will tune out. Avoiding these mistakes helps keep the climax clear and powerful. Practical exercise. Write the climax of your story by answering these questions. What is the greatest challenge the protagonist faces? How does the tension build up to that point? What are the consequences of the climax for the protagonist and for the story? Reread the scene and check if it generates enough emotion and involvement. We've already covered building narrative tension and creating an effective climax, but now we're going to focus on something that's crucial to keeping the reader engaged throughout the story. Chapter endings. Each chapter is an essential part of the narrative construction. If it ends weakly or inconclusively, the reader may lose interest. If, on the other hand, the ending is strong and well constructed, the reader will be encouraged to continue reading until reaching the climax of the book. A Yale University study showed that books with well-structured chapter endings are much more likely to be read to the end than those with weak endings. In this lesson, you'll learn: what are the functions of chapter endings and why are they crucial to the narrative? Different techniques for closing a chapter and maintaining high suspense. How to effectively connect chapter endings to the climax of the book. Common mistakes to avoid when closing chapters. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to write powerful and strategic chapter endings that will keep the reader reading. The role of a chapter. Conclusion. A chapter ending is a key narrative moment. It must fulfill three main functions: maintain the reader's attention, encouraging them to read the next chapter; strengthen the narrative tension, progressively approaching the climax of the book; provide a sense of progression, advancing the story and the development of the protagonist. Examples of effective chapter endings. He heard the noise behind him. He turned, but the room was empty. Creates suspense and encourages reading further. He finally had the answer, but it meant everything he knew was a lie. Introduces a plot twist and stimulates curiosity. Tomorrow he would make the most difficult decision of his life. It builds anticipation and anticipation. A well-written ending keeps the reader engaged and creates a sense of continuity that leads to the climax. Techniques for writing an engaging chapter. Conclusion. 1. The cliffhanger, leaving the reader in suspense. This technique involves ending the chapter with an unanswered question, an imminent danger, or a shocking revelation. Example: the door slowly opened. Someone had come in, but they couldn't see it. Pros: keeps the reader glued to the book. Cons: if used too often, it can feel artificial. 2. The turning point, changing the rules of the game. A chapter can end with a revelation or a drastic change in the story. Example: he had just signed the contract. He didn't know that this decision would change his life forever. Pros: it adds depth and dynamism to the story. Cons: it must be well constructed so as not to seem forced. 3. The moment of reflection. Give pause and depth. Not all chapters need to end with extreme tension. Some can end with an internal reflection of the protagonist. Example: he looked at the sunset and realized that, no matter what happened, he would never be the same again. Pros: it adds emotional dimension to the character. Cons: it should not slow down the pace of the story too much. 4. The final doubt, creating an irresistible question. The chapter ends with a question that the reader desperately wants to see answered. Example: what if he had it all wrong from the beginning? Pros: generates curiosity and engagement. Cons. Must be followed by a satisfying answer in subsequent chapters. How to connect chapters to the climax of the book. Each chapter must progressively bring the reader closer to the climax of the story. Gradually increase the tension and stakes. Leave hints and previews to prepare the reader for the climax. Gradually bring out the central theme of the story. Example. In a thriller, each chapter could add a new clue or a new suspect, leading up to the final revelation. In a coming-of-age novel, each chapter could represent a stage in the protagonist's inner evolution. If each chapter contributes to the narrative tension, the climax will be more intense and rewarding. Common mistakes to avoid when closing a chapter 1. Ending a chapter without a real conclusion. A chapter that ends flatly or without a clear development can lose the reader's interest. 2. Using too many cliffhangers. If each chapter ends with an extreme twist, the reader may perceive it as excessive. 3. Creating a chapter ending that is too long or slow. A chapter should end with a strong sentence. If the conclusion is long-winded, it loses its impact. 4. Not connecting chapters. Each chapter should flow naturally into the next, without abrupt interruptions. Avoiding these mistakes makes reading smoother and more engaging. Practical exercise. Write the last 3 sentences of 5 chapters of your book using different techniques: a cliffhanger, a turning point, a moment of reflection, a final doubt, a preview of the climax. Analyze which technique works best for your story. Lesson summary. Today we learned the importance of chapter endings to maintain narrative tension, different techniques for writing engaging chapter endings, how to connect each chapter to the climax of the book, mistakes to avoid when closing chapters. We've already explored chapter division, narrative pacing, and how to connect each chapter to the climax of the book, but now we're going to focus on one of the most powerful narrative techniques for keeping readers engaged: the cliffhanger. A cliffhanger is a method used to end a chapter or scene by leaving the reader with an unanswered question, a plot twist, or a shocking revelation that compels them to continue reading immediately. A study conducted by Harvard University showed that readers are more likely to complete a book when chapters end with unresolved tension rather than with a clean closure. In this lesson, you'll learn what a cliffhanger is and why it's so effective, the different types of cliffhangers and when to use them, how to integrate cliffhangers without making them predictable or forced, practical examples and strategies for applying this technique in your books, mistakes to avoid frustrating the reader. By the end of the lesson, you will be able to use the cliffhanger as a powerful narrative tool to maintain suspense and push the reader to turn the page. What is a cliffhanger, and why is it so effective? The term cliffhanger comes from the image of a character who remains suspended on a precipice, cliff, at the end of a scene or chapter, leaving the audience waiting to know what will happen. Generates suspense and emotional involvement in the reader, stimulates curiosity and the desire to discover the resolution of the conflict. Creates a smooth reading, pushing the reader to continue without interruptions. Examples of memorable cliffhangers: Sherlock Holmes falls from the Reichenbach Falls, a cliffhanger that kept readers in suspense until the next book. Harry found himself in front of a closed door. Behind it, a familiar voice called to him. Pushes the reader to continue. As he turned the corner, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Creates immediate and unresolved tension. A well-constructed cliffhanger makes the narrative more compelling and engaging. Types of cliffhangers and when to use them. There are different types of cliffhangers that can be adapted based on the genre and the type of tension you want to create. One-action cliffhanger. Interrupting a crucial moment. The chapter ends in the midst of an action, leaving the reader breathless. Perfect for thrillers, action novels, and fantasy. Example: the killer raised the knife. Then a gunshot rang out in the air. Pros: keeps the tension high and speeds up the pace of the story. Cons: must have a satisfying resolution in the next chapter. 2. Reveal cliffhanger, revealing a shocking secret. The chapter ends with a surprising revelation that changes the reader's perception of the story, perfect for psychological novels, mysteries, and dramas. Example: it was all a deception. The person he trusted the most betrayed him. Pros: keeps the reader's curiosity high. Cons: must be well constructed to avoid feeling too forced. 3. Emotional cliffhanger, a moment of psychological tension. The chapter ends with a strong emotional moment, leaving the reader waiting for the character's reaction. Perfect for dramas and coming-of-age stories. Example: he looked at the letter in his hands. He knew that once he read it, his life would change forever. Pros: strengthens the emotional bond between the reader and the protagonist. Cons: must be used with balance so as not to slow down the plot. 4. Cliffhanger with irresistible question, creating doubt in the reader. The chapter ends with a question that leaves the reader with the need to discover the answer. Perfect for any narrative genre. Example: what if he got it all wrong from the beginning? Pros: keeps the reader engaged in the story. Cons: must lead to a concrete answer as the story unfolds. How to use cliffhangers without frustrating the reader. A cliffhanger should be an invitation to read, not an obstacle. Here are some rules for using it to its full potential. Don't overuse it. If every chapter ends with a twist, the reader may get used to it and lose interest. Balance cliffhangers and resolutions. Make sure that any tension left hanging is answered. Avoid unresolved cliffhangers. Don't leave the reader with unanswered questions, especially at the end of the book. Use cliffhangers that are appropriate to the tone of the story. A mystery and a romance novel will have different needs in terms of suspense. Following these rules allows you to keep the tension high without frustrating the reader. Practical exercise. Write 3 chapter endings using different cliffhanger techniques. 1 action, 1 revelation, 1 emotional. Analyze which one works best for your story and how you can improve it. Lesson summary. Today we learned: what is a cliffhanger and why it is a powerful narrative tool, the different types of cliffhangers and when to use them, how to build an effective cliffhanger without frustrating the reader, common mistakes to avoid to keep the suspense high. Thanks for following this lesson. See you next time.